It seemed like nothing more than a simple family photograph at first glance, but if you focus carefully on one small detail, everything begins to feel different. The image rests quietly inside a climate-controlled drawer at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's been catalogued, preserved, and mostly ignored for decades. In March 2024, during a routine digitization process, Dr. Maya Freeman, an expert in post-Reconstruction African American history, pulls it from its protective sleeve. The photograph is astonishingly well preserved, a formal studio portrait from around 1900, captured in soft sepia tones that have barely faded with time. 6 figures are arranged with the stiff, deliberate posture typical of early photography, when long exposure times required absolute stillness. It shows a black family. The father stands behind the group, dressed in a dark wool suit that appears carefully chosen, perhaps his best. His hand rests firmly on his wife's shoulder. She sits upright in an ornate chair, wearing a high-neck dress with fine lace detailing. Her hair is pulled back tightly, her expression controlled but weary. 4 children are positioned around them. 3 boys wear nearly identical outfits, knickers, white shirts, and rigid collars. Beside them stands a small girl no older than 5, dressed in a white cotton dress decorated with delicate embroidery. Maya leans closer, adjusting her magnification lens under the bright light. She studies each face in silence. These are people who may have been born into slavery and lived to see freedom, but what that freedom truly meant in Mississippi at the turn of the century is complicated. Reconstruction had ended decades earlier. Jim Crow laws were tightening their grip. Black families existed in a fragile space between survival and danger. The father's expression is proud but cautious. The mother's face reveals a quiet exhaustion beneath her composed exterior. The boys stare directly at the camera with an intensity that feels far too mature for their age. Then Maya notices the youngest child. The little girl stands slightly apart, her face softer, less burdened than the others. But it's not her expression that captures attention, it's her hand. While everyone else holds conventional poses, hands folded, resting naturally or placed behind their backs, the girl's left hand is positioned deliberately against her chest. 3 fingers are extended upward, her index and middle fingers crossed tightly over her thumb. Maya freezes. The gesture is too precise, too intentional, not the kind of movement a child would make by accident, especially during a long exposure photograph where stillness was critical. She quickly captures a high-resolution image of the detail, zooming in until the tiny hand fills her screen. Suddenly, the painted studio backdrop, once just decorative, feels staged, almost like a disguise, a performance hiding something beneath the surface. What were they communicating? Why would a family embed a signal into a formal portrait? Maya turns to the museum's records. The photograph had been donated decades earlier as part of a collection of early African American portraits. No names, no detailed history, only a vague note, Mississippi family circa 1900. 6 unknown faces, and 1 unmistakable gesture. What unsettles her most is the implication. If this is a coded signal, it doesn't align with anything commonly documented. The Underground Railroad was believed to have ended decades earlier after the Civil War, yet this image suggests something lingering, something hidden. A message preserved in plain sight. Maya feels a surge of energy, the kind that comes when history refuses to stay quiet. She prints an enlarged copy and pins it to her office board. That small hand becomes the center of everything. For days she immerses herself in research. Old maps of Mississippi, census records, studies on Reconstruction and the systems that replace slavery with new forms of control. She reviews everything she knows about covert communication, songs, stories, coded language, even quilt patterns said to guide escape routes. But nothing matches the gesture. It begins to haunt her, the 3 crossed fingers, so deliberate, so meaningful. She expands her search, digging through academic databases and obscure publications. Still nothing, no record, no explanation. Finally, she reaches out to someone who might understand. Dr. Elliot Richardson, a veteran historian who spent decades studying hidden resistance networks among Black communities. Maya sends him the images, unsure of what he'll find. His response comes quickly. "This changes everything I thought I knew, call me immediately." When she hears his voice, there's a tension in it, something between disbelief and urgency. He asks where she found the photograph. She explains, Smithsonian Archive, Mississippi, no names. There's a pause before he speaks again. "Maya, you need to understand so. Mething," he says carefully, "the story we tell about the past isn't always the full truth." She listens, pen ready in her hand. The Underground Railroad didn't simply disappear after the Civil War. That's the version we teach because it's clean, easy to understand. Slavery ended and the system stopped. Another pause. But real life doesn't work that way. His voice lowers slightly, as if the weight of the truth still affects him after all these years. Networks don't vanish overnight, especially not ones built on survival. Maya feels the room shift around her as the implications settle in. The photograph on her wall is no longer just a portrait. It's evidence. After Reconstruction collapsed in 1877, the South transformed into a place of constant danger for black communities. Lynchings became common. Night riders terrorized families under the cover of darkness. Economic systems were designed to trap people in poverty, while Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and stripped away rights. Freedom existed in name, but protection did not. Black families were left exposed, forced to survive in a hostile and unpredictable environment. Because of this, protection networks became just as necessary as they had been during slavery, perhaps even more so. Without federal enforcement or safety, communities had to rely on one another. The systems that once helped people escape slavery didn't simply disappear, they adapted. Elliot explains it carefully, choosing his words with precision. The original conductors and station masters of those networks, those who survived, didn't abandon what they had built, they reshaped it. New codes were created, new safe houses established, new routes mapped out not just for escape but for survival. These systems helped families move quietly to safer regions, often to northern cities. They allowed warnings to spread quickly when danger approached. And they operated in complete secrecy for decades, stretching from the end of Reconstruction into the early 20th century. Maya stares at the photograph on her wall, her focus returning again to the small, deliberate gesture made by the child. She tells Elliot that it's the most unsettling part. She studied oral histories, coded letters, generational accounts, everything she could find about hidden communication systems. There have always been whispers about hand signals, scattered stories passed down through families, but nothing concrete, nothing visual, nothing confirmed. Elliot's voice lowers as he responds. What you're looking at, he says, is something extremely rare. That gesture has a name. It was known as the reload signal. It indicated that a family was connected to the network, that they were prepared, trusted, and ready either to help others or to receive help themselves. Maya feels a chill as she listens. He continues, explaining that the signal was often taught to children deliberately. Children could move more freely without raising suspicion. Adults were watched, questioned, targeted, but children were often overlooked. If something happened to the parents, if they were arrested, attacked, or killed, the child would still carry the knowledge. The signal would allow them to identify safe families, people who would understand without words and offer protection. Maya looks again at the little girl in the photograph, dressed in white, her expression soft and unaware of the weight she carried. That small hand pressed against her chest suddenly feels heavy with meaning. It wasn't just a pose, it was preparation, a silent acknowledgement that her parents understood the risks they faced every day. The realization settles deeply. That child had been taught what to do in the event of unimaginable loss. Maya knows she needs to trace this further. The photograph itself might hold more clues. Turning it over, she examines the back carefully. There's a faint stamp, partially worn but still visible under magnification. Sterling and Sons Photography, Natchez, Mississippi. It's a starting point. She spends the next 2 days researching Natchez as it existed in 1900. The city sits along the Mississippi River, once a center of wealth built on cotton and slavery. By the turn of the century, it had become a place where black families navigated daily oppression, violence, and systemic inequality. She discovers that Sterling and Sons operated for nearly 2 decades, from the early 1890s to around 1911. It was one of the few studios in the region that served black clients with consistency and respect. That alone makes it significant. Maya digs deeper. Census records, business directories, archived newspapers, anything she can find. Eventually, she comes across an obituary from 1928 for the studio's founder, Marcus Sterling. The notice describes him as a respected businessman who served his community with dignity for decades. The obituary also mentions his son, James Sterling, who continued working as a photographer after relocating to Chicago in the early 1900s. The trail shifts north. Following that lead, Maya eventually identifies a living descendant, Vanessa Sterling Hughes, James Sterling's great-granddaughter. She's a retired art teacher living on the south side of Chicago. Maya writes to her, explaining the research carefully and attaching a scan of the studio stamp from the photograph. The reply comes quickly. Vanessa explains that her great-grandfather rarely spoke about his years in Mississippi, but he held on to certain things. She invites Maya to visit. 3 days later, Maya finds herself sitting in Vanessa's living room. The space is filled with framed photographs, generations of family history captured in images. Vanessa, now in her 70s, greets her warmly before bringing out an old wooden trunk. She explains that the trunk belonged to James Sterling, carried with him when he left Mississippi in 1911. While he was alive, no one was allowed to open it. After his passing, it was passed down, but its contents were never fully understood. Until now. Inside, Maya finds hundreds of glass plate negatives, each one carefully wrapped and preserved. They are portraits, families from Natchez captured over nearly 2 decades. Beneath the plates lie 3 leather-bound journals filled with handwritten entries. Vanessa opens one and begins turning the pages. Her great-grandfather documented everything, names, dates, sometimes even notes about why families came to the studio. Maya leans forward as the pages turn, her heart beginning to race. They stop at an entry dated September 14, 1900. Coleman family, 6 portraits, express order, 3-day rush, special arrangement. Maya repeats the name quietly, Coleman. She asks what special arrangement might mean. Vanessa meets her gaze, something deeper passing between them. She explains that the studio wasn't just a place for photographs. It functioned as something more, a safe point within a larger system. Families who needed help knew they could come there. James Sterling never openly described it, not even in his journals, but the implication is clear. He recorded people who were preparing to disappear, families who needed documentation of their existence before leaving everything behind. The photograph Maya found wasn't just a portrait. It was proof that they had been there, that they had lived, that they existed before stepping into an uncertain future. Maya stares at the entry again, 6 people, 1 small girl carrying a signal meant to outlast them. She asks if the original glass plate negative still exists. Vanessa smiles slightly and moves back to the trunk. Carefully, she lifts a wooden case filled with fragile glass plates, each wrapped in aged cloth. She sorts through them slowly, following the dates, until she reaches September 1900. Then she finds it. Holding it up to the light, the image appears in reverse, dark figures against a pale background but unmistakable. The same family, the same arrangement, and the same small hand fixed in that deliberate gesture. Maya asks if it can be professionally scanned. A higher resolution might reveal details invisible in the printed version. Vanessa agrees, mentioning a specialist at the Art Institute of Chicago who works with historic photographic materials. 2 days later, Maya stands in a conservation lab as the glass plate is carefully placed into a high-resolution scanning system. The resulting image is astonishing. Every detail comes into focus: the texture of clothing, the subtle expressions, the fine lines that time had nearly erased. The specialist, Robert, zooms in on the child's hand. There's no doubt, he says, the positioning is intentional. The tension in the fingers suggests she held that gesture steadily, likely for the entire exposure. For a child so young, that would have required training. Maya nods quietly, she understands now. Robert then shifts the image slightly, pointing to another detail. The mother's left hand rests gently in her lap. On her middle finger is a ring, small but clearly engraved. Maya leans closer. The symbol is faint but visible, 3 interlocking circles forming a triangular shape. Vanessa asks what it means. Maya quickly captures the detail, her thoughts racing as the mystery deepens. I don't know yet, Maya says quietly, still studying the symbol, but it's connected somehow. Back at Vanessa's home, they return to the journals, this time with sharper focus. Page by page, Maya begins to notice a pattern. Certain family names are marked with small symbols in the margins, stars, circles, triangles, subtle but intentional. When she finds the entry for the Coleman family again, her breath catches. Next to their name are 3 interlocking circles, drawn carefully into the margin. He was marking them. Maya begins to understand. These symbols weren't random decorations or personal shorthand. They were identifiers, codes within the record. Different markings likely represented different roles, levels of trust, or types of need within the network. Vanessa flips back through earlier pages, scanning quickly before stopping at an entry from August 1900, just weeks before the Coleman photograph was taken. Look at this, she says. The entry mentions a Reverend Patterson. Notes beside his name describe a meeting, arrangements discussed, autumn departures planned. At the bottom of the entry, a number is written clearly. 12 families confirmed. Maya leans closer, her mind racing. 12 families preparing to leave Mississippi, she says. Not just the Colemans, this was coordinated. Vanessa frowns slightly, but why would so many families leave at once? Maya doesn't answer immediately. Instead, she reaches for her laptop and begins searching historical archives, narrowing her focus to Natchez in the year 1900. It doesn't take long. Within minutes, she finds a series of newspaper reports from late summer into early fall. Headlines from local publications detail escalating racial violence triggered, according to reports, by a disputed land claim, but the aftermath spread far beyond a single incident. Black landowners were targeted. 3 were lynched, churches were burned, entire families were threatened, driven from their homes or worse. The violence wasn't isolated, it was systematic, designed to dismantle any progress Black communities had made. Maya sits back, staring at the screen. The photograph was taken right in the middle of it, she says quietly, September 14th, at the height of the violence. Vanessa looks at the journal again, then back at Maya. They knew, Maya continues, they came to the studio because they knew they were about to leave, maybe forever. The photograph suddenly feels heavier than before. It wasn't just a portrait, it was a final record, a way to preserve their existence, their identity, before stepping into the unknown. They were documenting themselves, Maya says, holding on to who they were before they had to disappear. Vanessa gently touches the journal, her fingers resting on the fragile page. And my great-grandfather helped them do that, she says softly. Maya dives deeper into Natchez records from that period, piecing together a clearer picture. The violence, she discovers, wasn't random at all. It targeted specific families, those who had achieved something rare in the decades after emancipation. Families who owned land, ran businesses, built independence. The Colemans were among them. Through property records, Maya uncovers that Isaac Coleman owned 40 acres of farmland just outside Natchez. He had purchased it in 1892, an extraordinary accomplishment for a man born into slavery in 1861. Freed as an infant, he had somehow managed to build a life strong enough to acquire land and sustain it. That success made him visible. And in that environment, visibility made him vulnerable. Maya finds Isaac's name again in an agricultural report from 1899. It lists him among a small group of Black farmers producing cotton and vegetables for market. It was a sign of stability, even prosperity, but also a reason for resentment among white landowners who expected dependence, not competition. Then she finds the final piece. An October 1900 notice, a land auction listing. Coleman property, 40 acres, forfeited for unpaid taxes. Maya stares at it. A legal process on paper, but in reality something else entirely, a forced loss, a system designed to strip away what had been built. By the time the notice was published, the Colemans were already gone. They had left before everything was taken. Maya contacts Elliot again, sharing what she's uncovered. He listens carefully, then points her towards census records, the next step in tracing the family's path. If they left in late 1900, he explains, they would have gone north, cities where Black communities were growing, places where they could blend in and rebuild. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. Places of opportunity, but also anonymity. Maya begins searching census records from 1910, focusing on those cities. But the name Coleman appears again and again, too common to narrow easily. She needs something more specific. Then she remembers the children. 3 boys and a little girl. She estimates their ages based on the photograph. The oldest boy around 12, the next 10, the youngest about 7, and the girl perhaps 4 or 5. 10 years later, those ages would place them in their late teens and early 20s. Using that detail, she refines her search. She looks for families with 4 children whose ages align, cross-referencing with city directories, church records, and school listings. The process is slow, exhausting. Days pass as she filters through records, comparing names, ages, and locations. Finally, something clicks. A 1910 census record from Detroit. Isaac Coleman, age 49, listed as a laborer. His wife Esther, age 44. And their children, Thomas, Benjamin, Samuel, and Ruth. The ages match perfectly. 10 years older, just as expect. Maya exhales slowly. They made it, she says under her breath. They actually made it. But as she continues reading, another detail stands out. Under the section listing year of arrival in Michigan, it states 1900. All family members are recorded as being born in Mississippi. And then in the margin, written in the census taker's handwriting, a small note. Family declined to provide prior address. Maya stares at the words. Even a decade later, even hundreds of miles away, they were still protecting themselves, still guarding their past. They had erased Natchez from their story. Not because they forgot, but because remembering could be dangerous. The silence wasn't absence. It was survival. Maya stares at the name Ruth, the little girl in the white dress, the one who held her hand to her chest and formed that precise signal, a child carrying a code meant to protect her, to guide her if everything else was taken away. Maya makes a decision. She has to find out what happened to Ruth Coleman. Tracing a life across more than a century proves far more difficult than she expects. Records are incomplete, names change, histories disappear. Still, she begins with Detroit, starting from 1910 and moving forward. She searches for a black woman born in Mississippi around 1895 or 1896. Eventually, she finds a match. Ruth appears in Detroit school records from 1918, listed as a graduate of Cass Technical High School, one of very few black students in her class. It's a small but powerful detail, evidence that she not only survived, but found a way to move forward. After that, the trail fades for a time. Years pass in silence until Maya uncovers a marriage certificate dated 1921. Ruth Coleman had married a man named William Harris, a postal worker. The name change complicates everything, forcing Maya to retrace her steps under a new identity. But she doesn't stop. She follows Ruth Harris through city directories, finding addresses on Detroit's east side. There's no occupation listed in the records from the 1920s or 1930s, which doesn't surprise Maya. Many women's work during that era went undocumented, raising children, taking in laundry, doing domestic labor that left no official trace. Then something unexpected appears. Ruth's name surfaces in the archives of the Second Baptist Church of Detroit, one of the oldest black churches in the city, with deep historical roots stretching back to the era of the Underground Railroad. According to the records, Ruth served as a Sunday school teacher for nearly 4 decades, from 1925 until 1964. Maya pauses, taking that in, a life of quiet service, stability, community. She contacts the church and is eventually connected to its current historian, an elderly deacon named Frank Morrison. He oversees the archives and knows much of the church's history by memory. When Maya explains who she's researching, his reaction is immediate. "Mrs. Harris," he says, "of course I remember Sister Ruth." Maya leans forward, surprised. He explains that she taught his Sunday school class when he was a boy in the 1950s. He describes her as quiet, dignified, but deeply kind with children. She lived a long life, he adds, passed away in 1987, 91 years old. Maya feels a surge of excitement. Did she ever talk about Mississippi, she asks, about her childhood? There's a pause before he answers. Not once, he says gently. A lot of folks who came north back then, they didn't talk about where they came from. Too much pain, some things were better left buried. Maya nods, even though he can't see her. Did she have children? 4, he replies, 3 daughters and a son. The youngest daughter, Grace, still lives here in Detroit. She's a nurse. I can give you her number. That evening, Maya sits with her phone in hand, staring at the number before finally dialing. Grace Harris Thompson answers. At first, she's cautious. Another researcher asking questions about a past that has already been examined too many times, but Maya speaks carefully, explaining the photograph, the discovery, the small hand gesture. There's a shift on the other end of the line. Grace's voice softens. I need to see that picture, she says quietly. Can you send it to me? Maya emails the high-resolution scan and waits. 10 minutes pass. Then the phone rings. Grace is crying. That's my mother, she says through tears. That little girl, that's my mother. Maya closes her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. I've never seen a photograph of her as a child, Grace continues. She always told us there weren't any, that they were lost. They weren't lost, Maya says gently. They were hidden, protected. There's silence for a moment before Grace speaks again. The hand signal, she whispers. My mother did that once. Maya leans forward. I was about 8 years old, Grace continues. We were at church. An older woman came up to her, someone visiting from the south. They looked at each other and my mother made tea. That exact gesture with her hand. Her voice trembles slightly. The woman started crying. They hugged like they'd known each other forever, like family, but I'd never seen her before. Maya listens carefully. I asked my mother about it later, Grace says. She just smiled and told me, that's how we used to say hello in the old days, baby. The words hang in the air. A greeting, a signal, a connection that survived across decades. Grace agrees to meet Maya in person. Days later, they sit together in Grace's living room in Detroit. The space is filled with photographs, snapshots of Ruth's life over the years, her wedding portrait from 1921, images of her teaching Sunday school, family gatherings from the 1940s, 50s, all the way through the 1980s. A full life carefully documented. But there's a gap. Nothing from before 1910. Nothing from Mississippi. Until now. My mother was a woman of silences, Grace says softly. She loved us completely, but there were parts of her life we were never allowed to see. Whenever they asked about her childhood, Ruth would gently deflect. She would say, that was another life, baby. This is the life that matters now. Grace stands and retrieves a small wooden box. After she passed, she explains, I found this hidden at the back of her closet. I didn't know what to make of it. Inside are objects carefully preserved across decades. A small leather-bound Bible dated 1892, its pages worn and filled with neat handwritten notes. A cotton handkerchief embroidered with the initials E.C., Esther Coleman, 3 small wooden buttons hand-carved, and a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. Maya carefully opens it. It's a hand-drawn map, simple but detailed. Roads, rivers, landmarks, pencil markings indicate distances and instructions. 12 miles to Jackson, safe house barn with red door, avoid main road after dark. Maya exhales slowly. This is an escape route, she says. This is how your family fled Mississippi. Grace stares at the map, as if seeing her mother for the first time. She carried this her whole life, she whispers. Never showed anyone, never talked about it, but she kept it. Maya documents every detail, taking careful photographs. As she does, she notices another item tucked inside the box, a small folded piece of cloth. She opens it gently. Inside is a child's white dress, yellowed with time, embroidered with small flowers along the hem. Grace's hand trembles as she touches it. The dress, she says quietly. The one from the photograph, Maya replies. Grace nods slowly. She kept it. She kept the evidence, Maya says. Over the next hour, Grace begins sharing fragments of stories her mother told over the years. Not full narratives, just pieces, moments, memories that now begin to connect. Ruth had 3 brothers. Thomas, the oldest, went on to become a factory foreman in Detroit. Benjamin worked for the railroad. Samuel, the youngest, died in 1925 from tuberculosis. Their father, Isaac, spent years working in an automobile factory before his death in 1933. Their mother, Esther, took in laundry while helping raise her grandchildren, living until 1941. They never went back, Grace says, not once, not even to visit. She recalls something her grandfather used to say, that ground is soaked with too much blood, I'll never set foot there again. Maya listens quietly, then asks the question that has stayed with her from the beginning. Did your mother ever explain the hand signal, what it meant? Grace pauses, thinking carefully. Only once, she says, near the end of her life. She was in her 80s. I thought maybe she'd finally tell me everything. Grace's voice softens. She looked at me with these old, tired eyes, and she said it meant we took care of each other when nobody else would. That family wasn't just blood. It was anyone willing to risk everything to keep you alive. The words settle heavily between them. With Grace's permission, Maya begins reaching out to other relatives, descendants of the Coleman family and people connected to them in Detroit. Slowly, a much larger story begins to emerge. She speaks with Marcus, the grandson of Thomas Coleman, now in his 70s. He shares stories passed down through his grandfather about the journey north. Grandpa was 12 when they left, Marcus says. He told us they traveled mostly at night, moving from one place to another, safe houses. He describes barns, church basements, and the homes of families they had never met before. But everyone knew what to do, he says. Everyone understood the signals. He explains that the gesture Maya saw in the photograph was just one of many. There were different hand signs for different meanings, Warnings, confirmations, instructions. Danger ahead, safe to stay, keep moving, children present, he lists. They taught these to kids like lessons, like learning letters. It wasn't just communication. It was survival. As Maya continues her research, she realizes how complex the network truly was. Families who acted as safe housekeepers were positioned along routes leading north. Messages traveled in coded letters, through trusted messengers, and even hidden in songs sung during church gatherings. She discovers that the Second Baptist Church in Detroit, where Ruth spent decades teaching, was more than just a place of worship. Before the Civil War, it had served as a station on the Underground Railroad, and quietly after Reconstruction, it continued that role. The church's current pastor allows Maya access to historical records usually kept private. Within them, she finds coded entries spanning decades. Families arriving from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, often in groups, often during seasons when travel was hardest, but also when scrutiny was lower. They understood something, the pastor explains. The struggle didn't end when slavery did, so they built their own systems, protection, support, survival outside the structures that failed them. Maya begins to see the scale of it. This wasn't isolated. It was a network stretching across states, connecting communities through trust, secrecy, and shared purpose. She reconnects with Elliot, sharing her findings. He introduces her to other historians studying similar patterns in different regions. Together, they begin mapping what had long been invisible, an underground system that existed well into the 20th century. This changes everything, Elliot tells her. We've spent so long framing black communities as passive victims of that era, but they were building systems, intelligent, coordinated, resilient. Maya organizes a gathering in Detroit for September 2024. She works with local institutions to bring together descendants of families who fled Mississippi around 1900. Dozens attend. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, people whose families had scattered across states over generations, now reunited by a shared hidden history. Grace stands among them, seeing her mother's story not as an isolated past, but as part of something much larger. Marcus is there, others too, representing different branches of the family. Maya had prepared a formal presentation, but as she looks around the room, she realizes the research itself is only part of the story. The real story is in the people. Lives that exist because their ancestors knew how to survive. She projects the photograph onto a screen. Isaac and Esther, their sons, and Ruth, the little girl in the white dress, her hand raised in a gesture that carried meaning far beyond the moment it was captured. Maya speaks, her voice steady. That signal was a language of survival, a way to communicate when speaking openly wasn't safe. Your ancestors built systems that protected entire communities when nothing else did. She pauses, looking at the faces in front of her. This wasn't just resistance, it was strategy, it was intelligence, it was care. An elderly man raises his hand. He shares that his great-grandmother once operated a safe house in Alabama. She never spoke about it, even to her own children. She was afraid, he says, even years later. Someone asks why so many kept silent for so long. Grace answers, because survival leaves marks, she says, because they wanted their children to live without fear, because remembering meant reliving things they worked so hard to escape. She takes a breath. But silence has a cost too. It hides the courage, it erases the brilliance, and it leaves us not knowing what it took for us to be here. Marcus nods in agreement. We're telling these stories now, he says, while we still can. After the gathering, a museum curator approaches Maya. They want to create a permanent exhibition, not just about the Underground Railroad before the Civil War, but about what came after, the networks that continued in silence. They want her research to be part of it. Maya looks once more at the photograph of Ruth. A small child dressed carefully, holding a signal that would carry across more than a century. Yes, she says quietly, it's time people knew. The Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History opens its new permanent exhibition in February 2025. Hidden Signals, Networks of Survival After Emancipation becomes its centerpiece, with the Coleman family photograph anchoring the central gallery. Ruth's small hand gesture is enlarged, studied, and carefully explained, not as a strange curiosity, but as evidence of collective intelligence, coordination, and survival under extreme danger. Maya's research grows far beyond the original discovery in Mississippi and Michigan. She begins identifying similar coded systems across Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. What once looked like isolated stories now forms a pattern, entire invisible infrastructures of mutual protection operating beneath the surface of recorded history. Other historians take notice. Scholars begin re-examining regional archives with new questions, uncovering parallel networks that had previously gone unrecognized. Academic journals publish Maya's findings, documentary teams request interviews, conferences are organized. But the most meaningful impact doesn't happen in institutions. It happens quietly, in homes, church basements, and community gatherings where descendants begin sharing memories that were never written down, only passed through silence. Grace establishes a scholarship fund in Ruth's name, supporting students studying African American history and social justice. She partners with the museum to design educational programs that present these networks not as distant history, but as living examples of community organizing, mutual aid, and collective survival that still hold meaning today. The wooden box that once held Ruth's Bible, map, and childhood dress becomes part of the museum's permanent collection. It is displayed alongside James Sterling's journals and glass plate negatives, tangible remnants of systems that once operated in secrecy. Visitors can now see the physical artifacts that made survival possible: handwritten maps, coded instructions, and photographs taken before families disappeared into new lives. Across the country, families begin to reconnect. A woman in Chicago discovers relatives in Cleveland. A man in Philadelphia learns his great-aunt's descendants settled in Detroit. Branches of families separated for over a century begin to find one another again. What was once a hidden network of survival slowly transforms into a renewed network of remembrance. Maya returns to the Smithsonian, to where the journey first began, and requests an update to the record for the Coleman family photograph. No longer is it labeled as Unknown Family, circa 1900. It is corrected. Isaac and Esther Coleman Family, Natchez, Mississippi, September 1900. Photograph taken by James Sterling 3 weeks before the family fled racial violence. Child performing reload signal identified as Ruth Coleman, later Ruth Harris, 1896–1987, who became a Sunday school teacher in Detroit and preserved this history for 124 years. Maya sits with that change for a long time. She begins to wonder how many other images in archives around the world contain similar hidden truths, how many gestures, glances, and coded moments remain unnoticed simply because no one has looked closely enough. She makes a decision to keep searching. The photograph still sits in her office, a copy pinned to the corkboard above her desk. Every morning she sees it again: Isaac's protective stance, Esther's quiet strength, the boys holding themselves too seriously for their age, and Ruth small, bright, and still, her hand raised in a signal that once meant life itself. Outside, Detroit continues its rhythm. Children walk to school, workers move through cold morning air. The city, shaped by generations of migration like the Colemans, carries forward their legacy without knowing every detail of its origin. The photograph remains unchanged, but its meaning has shifted completely. What once looked like a simple family portrait is now understood as something far greater. Survival encoded in 3 crossed fingers. Resistance designed with care and intelligence, so precise it remained invisible for more than a century. Proof that love, when organized and deliberate, can extend protection far beyond a single lifetime. A network that began under slavery, adapted through the collapse of Reconstruction, and endured into the 20th century finally receives recognition, not because it was recorded in official history, but because it survived in gesture, memory, and silence. Ruth Coleman kept her childhood dress for 91 years. She never wore it again after that photograph, but she preserved it carefully, wrapped in cloth, hidden away, a quiet reminder of the moment her life was recorded before it changed forever. Now her descendants understand what she was preserving. Not just fabric, but history.